So this is how we're going to do it. Because I don't have the release form, and I do apologize for that, I'm going to ask you to say your full name.
Sure.
And that you understand that this is being used for educational purposes.
Sure.
And that we have the right to use the film.
course.
And then I'm going to ask you if your earliest Savannah relative and where they came from and who they were and why did they pick Savannah. And then when there's a lull in the conversation, I'm going to ask you a few questions,
Sure.
and the whole process will take about 20 minutes.
Okay. Do you want more about me, or do you want some about my past history,
It's a little
my
bit,
family history?
yes,
or-
I'm interested in growing up Jewish, and I will ask you some pointed
Sure.
questions that'll help
Sure.
direct you as the conversation
Sure.
goes. I'm going to ask you a little bit about anti-Semitism, what it is to
Right.
be Jewish, growing in a small
Right.
Jewish community. But first, let's talk about those that came before. So if you would, go ahead, tell me your name, tell me I have permission to use this, and tell me
Sure.
about your ancestors.
Sure. This is Julian Weitz, and I'm sitting here with Carol Greenberg, working on some recordings of Jewish life in Savannah, and she has permission to use this in an educational setting, and I'm sure we'll use proper discretion with however she uses this. I was born and raised here in Savannah, born in 1947. I have a brother, Harvey, who's 5 years older than me, Harvey Weitz, and a brother, Robert, who's 7 years younger than me. And let's see, my father's family started off Weitz and remains Weitz, W-E-I-T-Z. Probably started off Weitz because they came from Eastern Europe. Weitz being probably a German name, but I don't think my grandparents were from Germany. They probably were from Russia, I think. And they came here, Louis Weitz, and married my grandmother, Rose Schneider, and actually Snyder, I think. And they came here after the turn of the 20th century, but in the early 20th century. And my father was born in 1914, my father Izzy Weitz. My mother, Bernice, was born in 1917. And my father was one of 8 children, whose father passed away when my father was only 11. So his mother, my grandmother, Rose Weitz, was a widow with 8 children at a very young age, and had a big family as far as my father's side of the family is concerned. And most of his brothers and sisters, we lost Aunt Helen very early on, but most of them survived into their old adulthood, and some had families, some didn't, but they were always available to us. We always visited and spent a lot of time with family together. My mother's side of the family came here earlier. They came here in about 1890, I would say, or 1895. They first came to, this would be Julius and Rachel. I knew them as Hornstein. Everybody knew them as Hornstein. And they first came, my mother's grandfather came here, went to New York, as so many of them did. 2 cousins were eating Friday night dinner at this woman's house, and she said, come back next week, I'll have some ladies for you to meet. And so, of course, everything was very supervised, and it was a real mitzvah to introduce potential husbands and wives. And so the 2 men arrived, and she said, this one's for you, and this one's for you. And they said, no, I like this one, and no, I like this one. So they ended up being attracted to the particular, I think, two cousins married 2 sisters, I think. And so they did, in fact, get married. And I think one of the sisters ended up in Savannah. And my great-grandmother moved from New York with my great-grandfather. This is, again, Rachel and Julius Hornstein, further north, in fact, to Utica, where it was freezing, and it was much too cold for my great-grandmother. And she wanted to move south, and her husband, Julius, didn't want it. It was too hot down south, and so they made a democratic decision. They moved south, of course, and they went from Utica to someplace in Pennsylvania, and eventually ended up joining the rest of her family here in Savannah. They owned a grocery store on Bay and Farm, which is right across from the main post office, and they had 7 children, I think. They had 2 daughters and 5 sons, and so they lived in a spacious apartment above the grocery store, which was 2 bedrooms basically, and they had the parents in one bedroom and the 7 children in the other bedroom, which apparently was not so unusual. And they worked hard, and as the story goes, and they saved a little money, and then they wanted to buy the piece of property that the house was in, but the Hornsteins weren't citizens yet. So another member of the Jewish community here bought the property in his name, and when Mr. Hornstein became a citizen, they transferred it over to him. And I thought it was such an amazing thing that you would trust somebody with every penny you'd scrape together, give him the money, and he bought the land in his name. And it was just, that's the way Jewish people got along back then. I'm sure there were rivalries and this and that, whatever, but generally you hear about people helping other people. So they raised 5 sons and 2 daughters, and they all became successful, and they worked hard, and they certainly gave back to the community. I look at the photos of the presidents of the JEA and the Federation, and many members of the family are there, and I go across to the shul at the B.B. Jacob, and my father served on the board there, as he did here at the JEA many times. And we have one of the earliest presidents of the B.B. Jacob was Louis Weitz, and that's my middle name, although I'm not named for that Louis Weitz. I'm named for my father's father, Louis Weitz. But it's nice that there's that kind of continuity. We still have Weitzes living here. People want to know why it's Weitz, and I said, well, that's a Geechee pronunciation because we live here in Savannah. It's not Weitz, and it's not Weitz, and it's, whatever. But so my father's family still is very well represented here. We have cousins on the Lasky side, and we just have cousins on the Blair side, where one of my father's sisters married a Blair, and so we have lots of cousins that grew up here.
I'm fascinated, if you don't mind. 2 things there. I don't know why it is, but 9 out of 10 people tell me that their ancestors here had a grocery store. There must have been a grocery store on every corner.
No supermarkets.
And I'm trying to figure out, was it, because they were immigrants, was it just an easier job to find? Did it take less capital? And I'm also interested in the mention that someone couldn't buy property unless they were a citizen,
Right.
which is certainly not true today.
No, and I don't
Can
know
you
if it
speak
was.
to either of those?
I don't know that it was actually true, but this is just what I heard. It would be interesting to find out if that was the case or not. My grandmother and her brothers ended up with the grocery store. Some of them went into the real estate business. My mother's uncle, Sam Hornstein, went into the real estate business, but at least 2 of the brothers had grocery stores. One of them branched off from the family grocery store, and it was before supermarkets. And this particular grocery store was very interesting because, in addition to the typical grocery store in the front, they had a lunch room in the back. It wasn't you didn't pay for lunch. It was a place where the family came to eat. So every day, many days at least, my parents, this is before 1954 when the grocery store closed, would go over there. I mean, I went there as a child, and we would eat lunch there. And then there would be, oftentimes, my mother's uncle, Max Hornstein particularly, was very politically active. And so whoever his people were running for sheriff of Chatham County, he would often be there. We would have congressmen and other people there. It was a very political place as far as the lunch counter was concerned. And my father used to with a twinkle in his eye, used to tell me that the Bolito man, which was the local lottery guy, would stop at the back window of the grocery store, and the cook in the grocery store would hand him a nickel to play a certain number for the local lottery, and there was the sheriff of Chatham County sitting in the lunchroom there. But it was a very strong part of the community. They had torn down a lot of buildings and had built Yamacraw Village, which was subsidized housing project, I assume, back in those days. And because of my mother's uncle's influence, they didn't tear down the grocery store. He convinced them that they would need a grocery store, and it was part of the community. And sometimes people fell in hard times, but they still needed groceries, so they had what they call charge accounts, and their delivery man would deliver groceries to people in need. However, when the longshoremen got paid, they'd come in and pay up their whole month's bill. So it was an interesting, give and take with the community. It was a much more personal situation.
I was actually going to ask you about, and this is a little early in the conversation, but it seemed to be leading that way, the civil rights movement and your parents' relationships with blacks, and maybe your memories of growing up in the South in what would have been a segregated time for a lot of your earlier life, mostly because of the location of the store. I know that the three congregations were downtown at that point, and the Jewish Community Center before 1955 would have been on Barnard Street.
Right.
So there were Jewish community, and Broughton Street was Jewish,
And West Broad
but West Broad Street was also the border of the black community.
Right.
So do you remember anything about race relations or the working
Well,
relationship your parents had with?
I had a very jaundiced view because we had, both of my parents worked, and we had a wonderful housekeeper, Rosella, who came when, I guess, my brother was born, my youngest brother was born, and she basically raised us. She was very caring and very loving, and a pretty strict disciplinarian. So on one hand, she would fix fabulous meals for us and make sure we were all taken care of, but she didn't stand for any nonsense, and she was responsible for the house. And I remember calling my mother on the phone, because I could certainly remember it was just 5 digits back in those days, and I'd tell her that Rosella wouldn't let me do this or do that, and my mother would say, darling, when I'm not home, Rosella's in charge. You have to listen to her, and what she says goes. And so that was the way things were. She was responsible for me, but she did it with a very loving hand, and to all of us. So I always thought that everything was wonderful, that Rosella, was certainly treated with a great deal of respect in our house, and my parents wouldn't stand for anything less. And but of course, things were very difficult. When I went to her house, I realized that her house wasn't as nice as our house, and of course, I didn't know that she was getting paid $15 a week for whatever the salary was back then. But it was more than just a casual relationship. She worked for us for many, many years. She then worked for my father after I left the house, and my mother had passed away. My father was remarried, but after she couldn't work anymore, she received a salary for probably 15 years longer, and my brother, the attorney, took care of her legal affairs, and if she needed help with anything else, I took. So her position with the family remained, very important. When I was born in 1947, my parents lived with my grandmother, Lily Trace, and it was a multi-family house. It was a big house on the corner of 37th and Jefferson, and so there was a housekeeper, sometimes a housekeeper and a cook there, because it was a big family. And my grandmother always had the latest immigrants who were coming over from Germany. And I mentioned that the family name was Hornstein, which certainly sounds Jewish, but our cousin's names that came over was Einstoss. And it wasn't until very much later on that I realized that our original family name was Einstoss, and they came from Austria. and it was changed at Ellis Island to Ornstein. So we had Ornsteins and Einstahs, and they were cousins. They were from the same families. But my grandmother would put them in a room in our big house on 37th Street, and she would give them a deadline. She said, we'll have to find you an apartment and set you up and whatever, because you have to make room for other people who are coming. So they had a year. And she was very kind. It wasn't that she was throwing them in the street, but she set expectations for that. And it took a while for their remunerations from Germany or Austria to come through. And they didn't speak English very well at all. We had an uncle, we called him an uncle. He was a cousin, and we called him Uncle Yaya, because all he said was "ya, ya," and his name was Ludwig, and he carried candy in his pocket, much like Walter Lowe is the Pied Piper in Shul now. But we'd go up to him and hold out our hand, and he'd say, "What's my name?" And we'd say, "Ludwig." He said, "Yeah, yeah," and he'd give us a piece of candy. But there was always, when people were at work and the house was empty, we had Queenie at my grandmother's house before we even moved out, and she was just a wonderful, wonderful person. We had such loving relations with them that, again, we had a very jaundiced view.
Let me ask you about the social services that your family seems to provide. Now, I've heard stuff about Workman's Circle, and I've heard, of course, about Benot Hesed, and I've heard about ways in which now the Jewish Federation, of course, but the Jewish social services were set up and institutions were set up to help Jews because no one else was helping Jews, especially post-Holocaust or during those eras, which is a little bit before your time. But you're talking about a private family, almost contract with helping bring people over. Did they not go to the joint distribution committee to make these things happen?
But more than one couple came to Savannah, and since I remembered it would have to be 1952 or 53 at the very earliest. And I do remember that I at one time later on asked my father what Uncle Ludwig did for a living. He said he watches the ticker tape. So they got some remunerations from Germany and invested it in income, so he would be up at Merrill Lynch watching the ticker tape. So they didn't really need social services. They just needed some time to get set up and get straight like that. So, but it was a family thing. And listen, I'm sure there must have been members of the family that weren't as fortunate as other members, and they were all taken care of. They had that situation.
You were born right before Israel becomes a state. Of course, you would have been too young to remember. But the residual of the Holocaust and statehood, sometimes in the South, led to some extreme anti-Semitism. Do you remember any anti-Semitic problems when you were growing up, or maybe some clubs or sports teams that you weren't allowed to participate in?
Certainly none that I wanted to. I mean, the only thing that I really remembered was at one time the yacht club was restricted and the Oglethorpe club was restricted. But other than that, my parents were in the retail business, and we still are. We're have Friedman's Fine Art, and we're in the art business in the picture frame. And a large part of our clientele were Savannah Blue Bloods, basically. And they had a wonderful relationship with my parents and later on with me. And it was just, going to school, of course, I think I was just as prejudiced as anybody who was in school. I was very Jewish-centric. All of my friends were Jewish. We finished school, came immediately to the JEA, and depending upon the Hebrew school schedule, we had so many wonderful young kids, the Jewish kids here. We had a couple of AZA chapters and 2 or 3 BBG chapters, and there were so many people in the Hebrew school, we had to have split sessions, and it was just a great place to be. So we spent, less time than most people did in school and in school extracurricular activities. Most of our extracurricular activities were here at the JEA, and people found that unusual, particularly people from less cohesive areas, even Jewish people from less cohesive areas.
What was the educational expectation? Were your parents educated people? And what was their expectations and their the responsibility that you had in terms of schooling and
Right. My mother graduated high school. My mother Bernice graduated high school, and my father had to quit school at age 11 because his father passed away, as I mentioned. So he finished the fifth grade, but they were both very knowledgeable, polished people, as far as I could tell, and they held, particularly public school, at a level of reverence. You know, that they talked about teachers with great respect, and there was never a question about them interceding with any kind of problems that I thought, you know, in the second or third grade, when I thought I had been called down unfairly, and they would just tell me, you know, the teacher doesn't have eyes in the back of her head. She does the best she can, but, you know, she's the teacher, and you have to respect her. So there was a great deal of respect in our class for that. We had all kinds of encyclopedias and reference books available. We would watch certain specials on TV. We would gather around the television in the early days because it was going to be something that was important for the children to see. And then my mother's aunts and uncles always doted on us, so they were always talking about opportunities and how important it was, and they set an example, and they really did. They helped with education, both Jewish education and secular education in the city. So education was held. We were encouraged. I was never really handled with an iron hand as far as locked in my room to do my homework or whatever. But you know, if there was ever a problem, my parents were right there, and all three of us were fortunate to do well in school, and just have been raised with a great deal of encouragement, so that my wife says, all three of you guys have bulletproof egos. She said, what did your mother tell you? What did your mother say to you? I said, well, you know, she loved us, and she never said anything bad about us. She certainly never, you know, degraded us in the least bit. But I said, we did. We lived a charmed life. We had wonderful friends and wonderful relationships, both, you know, with your boyfriends and your girlfriends. We had a wonderful mixed community here as far as the Jewish community was concerned. And we just were encouraged. We came to the JEA, and we had great staff people here that helped us and took care of us and expected good things from us. They encouraged us to do that. So we constantly learned. We had AZA programs where we did debate and oratory and things like that, and you had to go and prepare. It was interesting.
What is it about Savannah that made you want to come and live your life here and raise your children here?
Well, again, I had, you know, we all had a charmed background, and we had very close friendships. Even today, you know, we've had a few people who've certainly moved out of town, but there are a number of my very closest friends who live here. And they say, how long have you known each other? And we say, you know, from the crib. Literally, our parents were best friends, and, you know, we stayed best friends. I'm 67, and I have friends that I've known for 67 years, literally. So Jean and I moved to Atlanta for a couple of years just to make sure before we joined the family business, and we certainly had good friends in Atlanta, but we didn't think we gained as much as we gave up. And so we've always found the close-knit nature of the Savannah Jewish community and the overall community to be a real bonus. Some people said, everybody knows your business. How can you live in Savannah? And I said, well, you know, I find it comforting that people know me, and you can keep your reputation to a point that you really don't care what people know. It's nice to have people know you. And when we got married 42, almost 43 years ago, she came here and immediately was welcome to the community. So it was where we wanted to raise our children.
When your children became older and they went off to school, what were you hoping that they would choose in terms of where to live? And were you hoping that they would come back, or had things changed so much by that point that you didn't think that they would find what they needed here in this community?
Well, I think your priority, of course, is that you want your children to be happy. So within those parameters, within that parameter, we certainly wanted what was best for them. But of course, I mean, it was a dream to have children who eventually got married and moved back here. Our son Michael was living in New York and met a fabulous Israeli woman, and now he lives in Tel Aviv. So they come visit us, and we go to visit them, and they live such an amazing life over there that it's hard for me to begrudge it. But we miss him. We certainly would like to see him more, and we hopefully will. That we have some more time when I'm kind of semi-retired, and we'll make more trips over there. Our daughter Lauren was in school in Worcester, Massachusetts, and met a young man from Worcester, he and his family. And so Lauren and Adam were married. We're married here in Savannah, had already moved here, but they knew each other in Worcester for a few years. And I remember Lauren calling and saying, I'm dating a nice guy. We said, wow, terrific. And so the first thing, before we could even bother to hint around, we didn't want to make it, she said, and his mother is vice president of the synagogue. And I said, oh, okay, well, that's nice. So she said, and Friday night dinner is just like Friday night dinner at our house. So it was nice. So Adam and Lauren moved here a few years ago, and it's just been spectacular. And we have another generation on the way. So we hope that, of course, the grandchild will be born and will first of all be happy, but if they decide to live in Savannah, that would be wonderful too. It's a great place to live.
What has changed? There aren't the numbers of children anymore. We don't have the critical mass that you're talking about, so that everybody joins the community center and the community. Somebody suggested that because there's a lack of anti-Semitism and there's an acceptance of Jews in other places, that somebody could join a Y, for example, instead of the Jewish option.
Right.
Not that we need to go back to a time where Jews could only do Jewish things in Jewish institutions, but is there a solution that you can see for your grandchildren to make sure that they always feel that the institutions that are Jewish are worthy of their support, and that in some ways there is benefit to joining the Jewish option?
Right. Well, if the JEA still has what I think it has to offer, then first you've got to expose them to it. You need to bring them here early and often, and have them participate in the wonderful programs that are here. The synagogues, the same way, they all have great programs, and really, if anything, I think much more welcoming these days than when I was growing up. I think that people feel more comfortable, even particularly the younger kids, and there's a great effort made to welcome the younger kids to both the JEA and the individual synagogues. And as to why things are not, maybe people are having less children, I'm not sure, but there are certainly more, you have more mobility, you're not just living near the JEA or near the synagogue, that people have more mobility, or spread out to the landings, or live downtown still, and all of that's been impactive on the number of Jewish people associated and such. We certainly would have high hopes that we do our best, whatever we can, to support the institutions, as far as the Jewish institutions in our community, and we wish them, another 125 years of success here. Absolutely.
You don't talk about being religious, and yet you belong to the B.B. Jacob. You don't talk about necessarily finding a need or to follow the leader or any special skills, and yet you've mentioned that so many members of your family have led life of leadership. How do you get the leadership bug? How do you get the sense of who you are Jewishly? Is it because of the way your house was run? Is it something innate that you just got by growing up? Is it something that you were aware of, that you were witnessing, that this one is doing this and this one is doing that, and therefore I should do the same? Where does it come from?
It's probably a combination of things. I think that certainly our parents and grandparents and relatives set a great example. As I said, pictures are on the wall, and my father and mother both were very active in Jewish causes and Jewish community here. My mother said that when she was growing up, that the Meshulam used to come for the different yeshivas and for the Jewish National Fund and whatever, and they would have these little blue boxes that they literally nailed into the little cupboard. It's a big pantry, actually, at my grandmother's house, and so you'd see these little blue boxes. And once a year, they'd travel through, they'd knock on the door. No matter who was home, they'd walk straight through, and they'd take their box off the wall and nail a new one up. So it was a tradition of Jewish causes and Jewish charity. And, my parents were always very, I think they were proud of what they did. And we could see them, that it meant something to them. It meant a great deal to them. So we followed in their steps. I've always been very sensitive about kind of getting something for nothing. We have these great institutions here, and you have to contribute. You have to give back some. So I don't know. It would embarrass me if I wasn't able to, in some way. If you can't give financially, then you do some work. If you can't do this, you need to do something. If you approve and you want to keep it going and make it better, you have to participate. And so we've had just great leadership. Sometimes it becomes easier or more difficult to find people to step into these positions because people are very busy. But when the chips are down, we have great people who have stepped up, people who've moved to town, present company included, and they've really made a huge contribution. So, as I said, I've been on the board of both the JEA and the Federation and the Shul, and it just makes you feel better that you should contribute.
I didn't mean to embarrass you. I know that you're extremely generous and you are a great leader, and I know it's hard to talk about yourself that way. Has Savannah changed for the better or worse since you were a child? And what changes have you noted?
Right. Well, again, it depends on what view you're looking through. Certainly, we've been fortunate enough to I was the fourth generation to work in our family business, and we inherited maybe not only in a financial situation, but we inherited the ability to make a living. We were trained in the business. I was trained in the business and spent my life around it, so it was kind of a natural thing for me. And but there are a lot of people who still, to this day, a large part of the citizens of Savannah, African American community, other certainly the white members of the community that haven't really enjoyed the financial success, and the had unequal educational opportunities and whatever. So I'll say that you've had both. You've had a lot of progress here in Savannah, and then you've had a lot of things that just have not been done the way they should have done, and had a lot of difficulties. and a lot of more difficulties that have been created from it. So we have a long way to go as far as number two.
Is there something that the general Savannah community could learn from Jewish ethics and Jewish teachings that you think would
That's
translate?
Very presumptuous. I don't know. I don't even know if I can respond to that because, certainly we can learn from each other. Everybody can. And in any strata of the community, you've got such a diversity of good people and bad people and caring people and people who are very selfish. And, it's the same cross-section. Even in our Jewish community, you're not going to find 100% of the people with angel's wings here, like we used to think. There used to be not much alcoholism, not much divorce, not much intermarriage, not much this or that. But we've become more representative of the population in general. And yet, do I think there's still wonderful, wonderful people in both communities? Certainly. But I think we have a lot to teach each other, Pop. No question.
Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you wish we had discussed?
Well, my wife, Jean, back talking about leadership. And,
I tried to get her to come in for an interview.
Yeah.
And I didn't ask you about it because I'm still hoping that she'll...
Well, maybe. But she's home now preparing for yet another National Hadassah Convention. And she been active in Hadassah, I don't know, 30-something years, I guess, and you as well. And
on the national level.
Yeah, very proud.
She needs to come in and tell me the stories.
Sure.
But I want you to think just one more thing. I want you to tell me if you were talking to your grandchildren.
Which I hope to be soon.
Which you hope to be grandpa
yes,
real soon.
Yes.
What is it about growing up Jewish in the South, Savannah particularly, that you want them to know about you and you want to impart?
Well, I think you can still make a lot of welcome choices. Everybody doesn't have to be the same Jew in Savannah. It allows you to be kind of who you want to be, how it matters to you. I once heard a gentleman talk about Rabbi Slatus, our rabbi at the B.B. Jacob, and said, for a rabbi to be a rabbi of an Orthodox congregation where everybody is very observant and committed, he said, it's a difficult job. He said, for a rabbi to be in Savannah, Georgia, and be a rabbi of an Orthodox congregation that has people who observe from this level to this level, he said it's a very difficult job, but it's a wonderful thing. You can live in Savannah, you can be a member of any of the 3 congregations, and even within those congregations, you can decide to practice Judaism the way you want to. I think that it's much more welcoming now. At least I feel that way with myself. So I think that I tell my grandchildren that we have a great deal of history and tradition that we need to preserve, but not just because it's a relic of the past. That a lot of these same teachings and a lot of these same opportunities that were given to us came from our religion and will be needed even more so into the future probably. So that's what I would tell them.
Thank you very much.
Good, sure. Thank you.